Welcome to the Center for Advanced Studies in Child Welfare Professional Training Module on Refugee Communities in Minnesota. This is an updated introductory module that includes the perspective of local refugee community leaders. We are grateful for the financial support of the federal Title IV-E funding through the Minnesota Department of Human Services and the Center for Advanced Studies in Child Welfare. This module begins with an update on Minnesota's refugee populations and recent resettlement trends. We will then speak more generally about common refugee experiences and their significance to working with refugee families, before providing a brief overview of 4 growing local refugee communities and sharing advice from local community leaders within each. In Part 1, we will present an overview of Minnesota's refugee communities and patterns of refugee resettlement in Minnesota from recent years. We will be paying special attention to counties outside of Hennepin and Ramsey County, with recent notable increases in refugee resettlement. As you can see from this slide, Minnesota has a long history of providing resettlement opportunities for incoming refugees. While fluctuations in these trends from year to year can be understood in relation to changing national policy, Minnesota continues to welcome refugee families into our communities each year. While we will get more into specific community information later on, here's an at-a-glance view of resettlement demographics from Minnesota Department of Human Services for 2019. As you can see, Minnesota continues to welcome many refugees into our state, with significant proportions of recent refugee resettlements being Karen refugees from Burma and Congolese refugees. To expand on the graph from the previous slide for a bit more perspective, here are the largest refugee communities that have been resettled in Minnesota since 2005. For the purposes of this presentation, we will focus on the Nepali Bhutanese community from Bhutan, the Karen community from Burma, the Oromo community from Ethiopia, and the Somali community from Somalia. What is perhaps more notable recently is that more and more refugees are resettling outside of Ramsey and Hennepin County. Here are those state-level numbers from the prior 2 slides, broken down for the 5 counties where many of these refugees are choosing to make a home. Again, the picture becomes clearer when we look across the past several years. Since 2010, 837 refugees have resettled in Anoka County, 229 have resettled in Dakota County, 890 have resettled in Olmsted County, 124 in Scott County, and 1,418 refugees have resettled in Stearns County. The reason for this trend appears to be the availability of work. Because the common hardship of refugee resettlement is a loss of formerly held credentials from your home country and other occupation-related barriers, industry jobs like the one seen here provide a necessary but limited employment opportunities to refugee families. Take a minute to find your county and review the information about the number of refugee arrivals and the major employers of your county's refugee community members. For greater review, you may simply pause this presentation or consult the accompanying handout on the Center for Advanced Studies in Child Welfare website. In Part 2, we will present an overview of what it means to be a refugee, common refugee experiences, and general background about the refugee process. For starters, let's talk about what we mean by the term refugee. The U.S. Refugee Program, established by the Refugee Act of 1980, provides a number of pre- and post-arrival services to persons who qualify as refugees who are admitted to the United States. Per the U.S. Immigration and Nationality Act, a refugee is a person who has crossed the border from their home country into a second country, seeking refuge from persecution. The term refugee officially refers to a legal immigration status that applies to individuals who have been persecuted or have a well-founded fear of persecution based on factors of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. According to the UN High Commission on Refugees report from June of 2020, there are currently 26 million refugees worldwide. After crossing the border from their home countries due to persecution, refugees generally gather in camps in second countries, awaiting a solution for their situation. There are generally three options available to refugees. They can wait until the persecution in their home country has ended and return to their homes. They can integrate into their country of refuge, or they can be resettled into a third country, usually a Western country in Europe or North America. Scholars have described the impact of the refugee experience by referring to the stages that affect all refugees' adjustment and resettlement. What refugees experience pre-flight, during flight, and in the refugee camps or cities of refuge continue to impact them once they are finally resettled. While it is important to note that the individual experiences and the effects of these experiences depend on the specific economic, social, and cultural considerations in each phase of the refugee experience, as well as the unique characteristics of each individual, it is helpful to working with refugee families to understand a bit more about what is generally involved in each phase in a bit more detail. Let's look at that now. The pre-flight period refers to the experiences that refugees face in the home country that lead to their decision to flee. By definition, refugees are people who have fled persecution in their country of origin and are unable to return. Thus, the pre-flight period for all refugees is one that is characterized by socio-political violence, oppression, or unrest. Many of the home countries of refugees in the United States have a long history of war and socio-political conflicts, during which refugees experience torture, rape, arbitrary detentions, seizure of property, ongoing surveillance, and murder, execution, and disappearances. Other experiences can include additional physical and sexual violence, witnessing death and violence, detention, forced labor, economic deprivation, food shortages, illness, and malnutrition, as well as the curtailment of rights such as freedom of expression, the freedom to assemble, and arbitrary, unjustified arrests. All of these tactics by governments and groups in power are intended to perpetuate fear and induce feelings of powerlessness. Experiences of war trauma and torture have been shown to be associated with psychological problems for refugee populations and can have negative impacts on family functioning. The period of flight is the experience of migration from one's home country to the country of their first asylum. Refugees are often forced to leave their home country with little preparation, on foot, and with few provisions. Refugees may walk for weeks or months to get to safety. Refugees are also commonly separated from their family members during this period, which includes extreme danger and the ongoing threat of harm. A statement of a Mozambican refugee interviewed in 1991 describes this experience. My own house was burning as I ran from it, leaving all of my possessions behind. All of my family managed to get away, but we were separated in the confusion. Over the next few days, we were gradually reunited, and we then began to travel towards the border. We took quiet routes by day and hid in the bush at night. During the reception phase, refugees spend time in limbo in their first country of refuge. All refugees have crossed an international border. They often seek shelter in a camp or urban area and are registered with the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, who may provide some basic relief items. While in the camps, refugees continue to face a lack of safety. Women are also vulnerable to sexual violence in this stage, especially if they must leave the camp to collect provisions and necessities such as firewood. Refugees, who often do not have documents to live legally in their country of asylum, face a continued fear of deportation back to their home country. Refugee camp conditions are often characterized by poor sanitation, limited access to nutritious food, poor health care, and limited education and employment opportunities. Thus, there are observed health consequences associated with prolonged asylum. The UNHCR defines a protracted refugee situation as one in which 25,000 or more refugees of the same nationality have been in exile for 5 years or longer. Currently, 2/3 of refugees have lived in a qualifying protracted situation. Finally, because refugees are unable to leave the camp or work legally in an area, they are forced to be dependent on outside aid to meet their basic needs. It is important to note that in addition to the traumas experienced in their home countries, research has found that refugee families experience significant stressors related to the resettlement and acculturation process. These stressors can impact their family functioning and parenting practices, and many of these stressors are identified as risk factors for involvement with CPS in the general population. Common resettlement stressors include language barriers. Since English is not the first language of a vast majority of refugees resettled in the United States, limited English proficiency can prevent refugee parents from finding employment, interacting with other communities, communicating with their children's school, and obtaining access to other financial, social, and medical resources. Discrimination. In the United States, refugees may experience racial, religious, or cultural discrimination. In addition to the potential impacts of discrimination on employment, housing, health, and social status, studies have found that even perceived discrimination negatively impacts the mental health and resettlement success of refugees. Another notable stressor is social isolation. Refugees have left their home communities, where they may have had deep social ties and connections that cannot be easily recreated upon their arrival to the U.S. In addition to emotional and psychological stress, social isolation also results in the loss of informal child monitoring networks that may have been present in their communities back home. All of these factors lead to a higher rate of poverty in refugee and immigrant families. While refugees receive social support services upon arrival to the U.S., these are considerably limited. Refugee families are only eligible for financial support and services through the U.S. resettlement program for 8 months after their arrival. These stressors are often further exacerbated by the loss of previously held occupational credentials. Upon arriving to the U.S., some refugees learn that the educational or vocational training they received in their home countries is not considered valid for similar positions in the U.S. As a result, they may have to settle for jobs that are lower skilled and lower paid, resulting in both increased financial stress and psychological stress related to the loss of professional identity. In addition to a changing professional role and identity, refugee families often experience stress from the changing family and gender roles that result from the influence of social norms in their country of resettlement. Employment opportunities, or lack thereof, and differences in language acquisition and acculturation among parents and children can result in feelings of loss of parenting authority and control over their children. The cumulative impact of these stressors, particularly when coupled with trauma experiences during flight and pre-flight, may result in an elevated need for health and mental health support. Although migration and resettlement involve significant challenges, refugee families also possess notable strengths and protective factors that can support psychological well-being, social adjustment, and positive family functioning. The first is their obvious ability to protect children through extraordinary circumstances. As we've previously discussed, families with refugee status have had to navigate extraordinarily dangerous conditions in their home countries and during their migration to the United States. Their ability to keep their children safe and their families intact under these incredibly trying conditions is a significant show of strength. Additionally, refugee families demonstrate resiliency, resourcefulness, and a strong commitment to their children by choosing migration from their home countries in order to provide a better future for their children. Additionally, they may develop strong social supports. Although they've had to leave the social connections in their countries of origin, many refugees develop strong social connections within refugee communities in the United States. These communities provide strong social supports for the families. Further, their existing religious or cultural values can be protective against potential sources of child abuse. Now that you have a more detailed understanding of common refugee experiences, it becomes easier to identify what these factors mean for your work with refugee communities. In Part 3, we will take a closer look at common themes experienced by refugee families when working with CPS, and how to use them to inform your child welfare practice. Before we dive into our specific findings, let's first look back at the stages. Consider the relevant strengths and obstacles associated with each stage, and the cumulative interactions of these stressors and strengths through each stage prior to and during resettlement in Minnesota. Think about how these common risks and resiliencies might influence your family assessment or work with a refugee family. Next, we'll move on to 4 emergent themes resulting from interviews with local refugee community leaders and how to improve interactions between CPS practitioners and refugee families. The themes we're about to cover were collected from a series of interviews with social service professionals and community leaders from local refugee communities, specifically aimed at identifying and addressing ways to improve these working relationships. The information that follows was pulled directly from repeated themes observed throughout collection of the interviews. Above are the 4 main resulting themes that came up many times in our interviews with refugee community leaders. The first is refugee communities' lack of awareness of the mission and goals of CPS. The second theme focused on the role of parental authority in the resettlement process, and how role changes and shifts in family dynamics impact considerations for CPS practitioners working with refugee families. Third, the significance of learned distrust of government actors from refugees' past experiences with persecution that caused them to flee their homes was repeatedly cited as having an important and unique implication to CPS involvement with refugee families. A final theme emerged related to the lack of proposed alternatives. That is, when parents are only told what not to do, it's hard to know what they can do. This can lead to feelings of helplessness, uncertainty, or powerlessness. Breaking the themes down one by one, we'll start with theme 1, a general lack of awareness of the mission and goals of CPS. Because of the uniqueness of child protective services in the United States, many refugee families aren't familiar with CPS, and resettlement education doesn't generally address it. Additionally, the information they are able to get often comes from informal communication with community members, which may or may not be accurate, and can increase parents' fears about CPS. So, it is incredibly important to explain the mission and values of CPS, emphasizing the child welfare system's appreciation for family relationships and prioritization of keeping the family intact whenever possible. Further education about how CPS works to provide resources and steps toward reunification when separation is necessary for the well-being of the child is central to building a trusting relationship with refugee families. Theme 2, Undermining Adult Authority. Remember back to our resettlement stressors slide, we saw that many of the stressors both resulted from and contributed to changing family roles and the loss of adult identity and authority. This becomes particularly salient as it relates to children's progress with resettlement and assimilation compared to their parents. In general, children acquire language and culture more quickly than their parents due to a variety of social and developmental factors. Special consideration of these dynamics is beneficial to a good working relationship with guardians. Validating efforts and obstacles and explicitly showing respect for parents in their family roles should be regularly considered when working with refugee families. Additionally, be sure to consider the associated frustrations or disempowerment related to not being able to advocate for oneself on matters related to their family, particularly after parents have faced cumulative hardships to ensure the health and safety of their children. For these reasons, it may be particularly helpful to avoid using children as translators, and when possible, to utilize a professional. Theme 3, Learn Distrust of Government Actors. By definition, refugee parents have encountered persecution or direct threat of persecution. As previously stated, many of these pre-flight conditions include occurrences like the threat or delivery of arbitrary punishment, arrest, detainment, physical harm, and particularly relevant to CPS, the sudden disappearance of loved ones. When we consider this context, the concerns related to the potential removal of children by CPS take on a new meaning. Thus, it is extremely important to distinguish yourself from other government actors such as police, and to make clear the processes, procedures, and priorities related to your work with families. It may be especially helpful to spend time establishing relational trust with refugee families in particular, by getting to know them and explaining your role within CPS, the role of CPS as an organization, and the limits on CPS's authority. Theme 4. Parents feel helpless when they lack alternative solutions. Similar to the first theme concerning knowledge about CPS, it is important to remember what parents might not know when you are working with them. When parents are only given the message of what they cannot or should not do, or what will get them into trouble, there is the potential to inadvertently increase parents' stress or feelings of helplessness. To avoid this, be sure to include possible pathways to remediate or avoid the problems you might be addressing. Get specific. The United States in particular has some very specific laws about what is and what is not abuse. Naming this as a cultural difference of the United States and explaining what terms like abuse mean is essential to establishing a common understanding for communicating with families and establishing trust. Be clear in how you communicate this and offer alternative practices that allow parents to enforce structure and safety within their families and that encourage them to continue to parent. It may be helpful to provide education both about the law and specific examples and alternatives for parenting support, behavior modification, and sustaining cultural parental authority while using new methods of discipline. In the final section, we will review brief histories and cultural considerations for 4 local refugee communities and hear directly from local community leaders with their advice for CPS professionals working with their communities. Burma has an estimated population of 50 million people. About half are ethnic Burman, while the other half are made up of multiple minority ethnic groups. The Karen are the largest ethnic minority group in Burma, with a population of about 6 to 7 million. Burma is currently ruled by a military dictatorship. The military government has perpetrated countless human rights abuses against the Karen, including rape, torture, imprisonment, forced relocation, and killing. Karen refugees have been fleeing into Thailand to escape persecution since 1980. Over 100,000 Karen refugees currently live in camps around the Thai-Burma border, and approximately 68,000 Karen refugees have been resettled in the United States. In Karen culture, being direct is considered rude, so Karen typically speak indirectly and may take a less direct route to their point. Because of this, direct communication can feel particularly jarring. Be careful to avoid communication that is too direct or blunt. Additionally, Karen may answer no to be modest or to avoid conflict, so asking questions multiple ways may be helpful. It is helpful to keep in mind that within American culture, this cultural politeness can lead to misunderstandings, as a Karen community member may not directly say if their needs are being met or if they disagree. Karen highly value education. Encouragement about their willingness to learn or of their child's progress in school may be an avenue of rapport. Be careful to monitor volume and body language. Use friendly greetings, smile often, and soften your approach. You may need to rephrase questions a few times if you do not at first receive an answer. Now we will hear from Etta Tazar, a Karen community leader and clinical coordinator with the Healing Heart program at the Center for Victims of Torture in St. Paul, Minnesota. She will lend her advice for CPS workers working with Karen families.
I think that being sensitive is always open up opportunity to hear the story of of the parents, before anything happened, and so a lot of our patient, I'm not sorry, a lot of clients or community members, they like I mentioned before, that they don't come here to America because they understand English. They don't understand English, and they are trying to understand the rule and the laws here. Some kids grow up here speaking English, and their parents are now growing up here, so they don't speak English. And so communication with family can become harder. I think education is one of the big things that we should be informed parents about, who they are, what is CPR, what are they really there for you, what are they supposed to do with you. I think that is one thing that I wanted to say, that it's important to talk to a parent and educate them about what is this, what is who we are. And so when a direct person came into the home and say, "You hate your kid. Why you hate your kid?" That is so direct. And so instead of saying that, let's step back and then listen to their story. Oh, tell me what happened. How can we? I'm here to help you, instead of saying, "I'm here to check on you." It sounded like that to me when I heard from parents saying that. Well, where I work, we work with a torture survivor, and a lot of people are coming through worse, and they went through a lot. At the time, they always have to be scared of everything. They're scared of everything, meaning that they're scared that they are while they're fleeing, and then they're scared when they lived in refugee camp. Different people, some community lived in, there are 7 camps that I understand, and each camp has a different system, but they always have to be afraid of the government, the Thai government or the Thai police. Korean people are dealing with a lot of anxiety, worry, and then stress, that it's been through all of the war, the fleeing, be living in refugee camp, how to deal with this new country. That is a stress, because the CPS is one of a member from government, and so they are in, like I said, like I told the story about Thailand, Thai police, when they got caught, they were took to jail, and if they're not, they have to pay money to be released. But for that, every people who are in power, they are already afraid of it already.
Notice that, even in this brief clip, you can see most of the themes arise. Next, we will talk about the Somali community. Somali civilians have for many years been caught in the middle of a chaotic and violent struggle for control of Somalia. Somali refugees report a torture exposure rate of 36%. According to the UN High Commission on Refugees, in 2016 there were over 2.5 million registered Somali refugees and Somalis living in refugee-like situations worldwide. Most Somali refugees flee to refugee camps in neighboring countries, particularly Kenya and Ethiopia, to await resettlement. The UN High Commission on Refugees estimates that over half of all Somali refugees worldwide are residing in these temporary refugee camp situations. Over the last 3 decades, 90,000 Somali refugees have migrated to the United States, with just over 42,000 residing in Minnesota. Somalis have established a large and vibrant community in Minneapolis and have established businesses, schools, and centers to serve their community. Unlike some new refugee communities, the Somali community in Minnesota is long established. Children who came up in the United States at a very young age or were born here to refugee parents may identify more with American culture. So, cultural gaps between generations can be significant in this community. Despite the presence of an established, resettled community, Somalis continue to experience social, mental, and physical health disparities. Somali society is organized into ancestral clans with membership in a clan determined by father's lineage. In a Somali home, the father is traditionally the wage earner and decision maker in the family. If the father is absent, this role is usually passed on to an older male relative. Women in Somali families have significant influence in the home. Their status is elevated by the number of children they have. Family is extremely important in Somalia, and children are highly valued in Somali culture. Most Somalis arriving in Minnesota are Sunni Muslims, and the practice of Islam is an integral part of life. According to Islamic traditions, women and men do not touch members of the opposite sex outside of their family, such as shaking hands. Additionally, women must cover their bodies, including their hair, although most Somali women do not wear a full face veil. The Somali language is universally spoken, with Arabic as a common second language. Somali families often rely on large family systems of care with multi-generational support for raising children. So if they've disconnected from their family, this can be particularly difficult. It may be helpful to acknowledge this potential grief related to separation from extended family. Additionally, it could help to suggest utilizing a collaborative approach and use or include chosen extended family when possible. Because of the importance of family, it's important to emphasize the CPS goal of keeping the child with their immediate family and caregivers as much as possible, and the supportive role of CPS to help regain continuity if separation becomes likely. Of particular importance is understanding the connection of discipline and power dynamics. It is helpful if CPS workers empower parents by explaining the difference between discipline and abuse. We will now hear from Wilner, who has worked for over 7 years as a mental health counselor with Somali families at Summit Guidance, and Ahmed Hassan, a psychotherapist and program director at Summit Guidance, and a leader in his community, about their acquired knowledge and advice for CPS workers working with Somali families.
For one, I will say, the concept of CPS was new to all of us, those of us who came from other countries. Because typically when, there is a child protection issues, it's usually other family members who come in and then take the responsibility, and if, the child has to be removed from home, then they take away the child and give to another cousin or uncle or other family members.
Perspective, and I think one of the hard part that they struggle with is back home they had, grandmother. There's that family system that take care of the kid, that they were not raising the child alone. Whereas here, the mother could be just alone, or the father, or just a couple might not have that support.
Well, what they don't know is that, first of all, the intention of the county is to keep child with the immediate family or with their parents as much as possible. I think if they know that piece, then they won't be as afraid as they are. So I think that message needs to be communicated well to them. And then the other piece that they don't know is that once the county takes the child, then they're working on the process of helping the family address whatever issue that led to this situation. And then if that is addressed, then hopefully the idea is that the child would go back to his parents.
So just also, that's one thing we do, just empowering that parent to say, yes, well, if there's something called abuse, this is what abuse looks like, this is what discipline looks like.
I was very surprised at some of the things that the CPS is already doing, because some of the cases that I've worked with, I've realized that sometimes, the CPS are involving other relatives and family members to even maybe keep the child, which I think is a very good idea, and it is in line with that tradition of having other family members to get involved and help the process. So I think if they can use more of that, I think that would be a win-win situation for both CPS, but also for the family.
Just understanding the culture that they're coming from, Yeah. So just understanding their background. Yeah, and a lot of parents go a lot of grief, and the grief is not just losing their belonging, losing their family system. The grandparents that were helpful, they're not there anymore. It was really, they're going through a lot. Yeah.
Next, we will learn about the Oromo community. The Oromo are the largest ethnic group in Ethiopia, with a population of 30 million. The Oromo claim an original homeland called Oromia within what is now Ethiopia. Under Ethiopia's current ruling government, the Oromo have experienced severe political and social oppression, including the banning of their language and cultural practices. The government is responsible for the torture of Oromo dissidents, sexual violence against Oromo women and men, and extrajudicial executions. To prevent the resistance, the government has instituted a widespread culture of surveillance and communication and a crackdown on free press and freedom of association. Due to decades of oppression, more than 2 million Oromo refugees have fled Ethiopia since the 1980s, and they are still fleeing violence today. Minnesota has one of the largest Oromo populations in the United States. Child protection is a completely new concept in the Oromo community. The perception is that child protection exists to take your children away, so it is important to emphasize the mission and values of CPS, as well as the collective role it hopes to play in supporting families. This is particularly important due to the previously mentioned culture of surveillance and distrust many Oromo refugees left. Oromo culture is communal. This includes discipline. Thus, it may be helpful to consider communal resources for supporting and working with families. In Oromo culture, respect for guests is very important. Ways to show respect include accepting hosts' offerings and removing shoes when entering the home. These are important signs of respect. Averting eye contact is also a sign of respect, so be aware of this both in how families communicate with you during meetings and how you communicate with them. Now we will hear from Bula Atamasa, who is an MSW and Social Work Unit Supervisor for Hennepin County. He will offer advice for CPS workers working with Oromo families.
Education is really very important to educate the community what child protection service means, what the culture or the system in the original country, in Ethiopia, and why the system over here is different. That education is important. And also let the community know that child protection is not the agency or a big monster who's going to come and take away your child. It's agency for the well-being of the child. Even sometimes, if the families are in a stressful situation, on really a situation which makes them to take unnecessary action, they may help that too. Maybe overwhelming of the system, maybe not having enough resources. Maybe the child protection may help to refer to that too. There are cultural barriers, language barriers, and system barriers. Those barriers are also reflected in child protection too. When it's coming to the culture, the children in the Oromo community, all the children are raised by family members, by village, and wherever you live, all are you are accountable for them too. And if you did anything wrong, they discipline you. Elders in the community discipline you, your older brother discipline you, your family members, those who neighbors will discipline you. They are really very respectful for the person who is visiting their home. They may invite the child or worker or the social worker to have food, to have at least water, and it's more as a sign of respect that getting something when you go to somebody's house to get something. If you say no, because of ethics or others, they may feel that you are thinking that you are not respecting them. When they go to their house too, most of the time they may ask you, Minnesota culture too. You can, because of the snow, because of whatever, you taking off your shoes is really important. When we communicate, we may not have eye contact sometimes, most of the time. For your elderly person, you don't see eye to eye to can be considered as a sign of disrespect. For the person from the authority, maybe when you come from government, say I came from county or from city or from the state, they may think that you are really respected, and to give more respect, they may not look eye to eye to the person. If they don't see that, I don't want the child protection worker look at, oh yeah, maybe mainstream or American culture, they may think that this person is lying or deceptive or not telling me the truth. No, it's a sign of respect.
Our final advice comes from the Nepali Bhutanese community. The Lotsampas are of Nepali origin and primarily live in southern Bhutan, close to Nepal. Southern Bhutanese speak Nepali and are primarily Hindu. In the 1980s, the Bhutanese began to perceive the southern Bhutanese as a threat to their power and instituted a series of policies that discriminated against them, including outlawing the Nepali language and southern Bhutanese cultural practices, and stripping many southern Bhutanese of their citizenship. When the southern Bhutanese demonstrated and organized against these changes, the Bhutanese government instituted a brutal crackdown, and several thousand people were imprisoned, and many were tortured. Bhutanese refugees were not permitted to seek refuge in neighboring India and had to continue on to Nepal. In 1991, at the request of the Nepali government, the United Nations High Commission on Refugees established 7 refugee camps in the southeastern lowlands of Nepal. By 2007, the year when the formal resettlement of Bhutanese refugees finally began, there were 108,000 refugees living in the Nepali camps. In 2015, just 2 camps remained with a combined population of 18,000 refugees. Because refugee families moved to camps in the early 1990s, but resettlement did not begin until 2008, many of the Bhutanese refugees are children who've never lived outside the camps. Because of the protracted nature of the situation in camps, conditions have deteriorated. Refugees are no longer allowed to seek employment outside of the camps. NGOs report depression, suicide, alcohol and drug abuse, dropping out of school, and gender-based violence increasing in camps. As a result, over 90,000 Bhutanese refugees have resettled in the U.S. Bhutanese generally live in multi-generational homes, and families are traditionally patriarchal, with the fathers acting as main decision-maker. Thus, it is particularly important to be mindful of adult authority, especially when children speak English and the adults in the family do not. Communication style is generally non-direct, so it's important to give ample time for communication style and to tailor your own communications accordingly. Additionally, hospitality is very highly valued. It is respectful to accept hosts' offerings and to remove your shoes when entering someone's home. The combination of this communication and relationship building style may require multiple visits or conversations to build a strong working relationship with families. Our final piece of expert advice comes from Parmananda Ketiwota, founding member and board chair of the Bhutanese Community Organization of Minnesota. He's been a local community leader in the Nepali Bhutanese community for many years, and offers his perspective and advice for CPS workers working with Bhutanese refugee families.
Another thing that I would say is different is the role reversal, because the kids speak English and they understand, they become the piece of like medium of communication in many of the families. Like a 6-year-old would be the medium of communication there and many other, because nobody else speaks English. somebody getting access, they would be an interpreter, informal interpreter to the family. So that way, the power dynamics is because it's always there's a background information that we talk about whenever we start. I right now also when we're talking, you ask a direct question and start weaving with so many other information. That's one thing. They will be, even if you ask them, they will be talking about how things and make that background before coming to a point. So it takes time. So you might have to take longer time to talk to them coming around. The community itself actually respects authority very, very much. So and also with the history that someone from the government, security personnel like police and soldiers, if they work, and they were the first thing that people were afraid of all those things. So there's hardly anything, nobody's going to oppose or nobody's going to even disrespectfully talk about it. Another thing, usually in the families, we take off our shoes and walk in, and they will offer you tea, they will offer you so many things, and they may or may not understand whether you can or cannot accept even tea in the house. But if you want to get more information, it might be not from the first visit, you might have to make a couple of visits and maybe even accept tea as not a problem, if it is okay, or if you're a tea drinker or whatever.
So as you have seen, advice related to each of the 4 themes came up in each interview. If you would like to see the full interviews, they are available at the Center for Advanced Studies in Child Welfare website at cascw.umn.edu. Thank you for visiting this professional training module on refugee communities in Minnesota for the Center for Advanced Studies in Child Welfare. We hope you'll learn some things about how to better tailor your work in child welfare to build strong working relationships with refugee families in your community. Please remember to complete the associated quiz to receive continuing education credit for what you've learned here today. The next few slides contain some additional community resources for working with specific refugee populations discussed in this presentation, followed by our references for the content of this presentation.